Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives in the world's leading global brands. Today we have a special guest on the show. We're joined by Alan Watkins, who is a physician and neuroscientist, an international expert on leadership and human performance, best-selling author and founder at Complete Coherence. Welcome to the show, Alan. How are you?
I'm really well, Chris. How are you?
Not too bad. Well, thanks for joining us on International HR Day.
Yeah, amazing, right?
I know.
We have a day for it now.
We have a day for it now. Even I was surprised, and I do this show every day. So you'd think I'd be fully aware of that. But big shout out to all of the HR leaders all around the world who, arguably probably the toughest time we've ever had to lead through.
Indeed.
So I wish you all the best, and I hope you're all safe and well during these times. But before we jump in, Alan, tell everyone a bit more about yourself personally and your journey to where we are today.
Yeah, so as you said, I trained as a physician. I was a jobbing physician for about 12 years in the NHS, but I left 25 years ago. So I've been doing this kind of work with leaders globally for twice as long as I was doctoring. And I often get, what's the connection? And the really connection between the two lives is human suffering. So, for me, when I was a doctor, it was always about the reduction of human suffering, but at scale. Now, I found when I was a consultant physician on the ward, I'd have 50 patients on the ward, 150 outpatients, 200 souls to deal with. So it was never really a big scale. And I thought, well, I go into general practice, you've got 2,000 people, but you don't see 1,800 of them because they're well. So again, you only have 200 people. So one of the things that caused me to leave 25 years ago is actually, if I work with big multinational corporations, like some of our clients have got 400,000 employees. So you change the quality of leadership at the top of those organizations, you directly affect the lives of 400,000. Now, if you take the families into consideration as well, you're at 2 million. If you take the supplier base, you're at 5 million just from one company. And we currently work with about 100 multinationals. So it gives you scale and, you can reach a much greater number of people and hopefully positively impact their lives.
Yeah. Similar inspiration for me, by the way, of why I started the show. We was doing our small workshops, our events, and they reach a few hundred people. I was like, I'd love to share all of this experience, the insights, the value I'm seeing in this room. How do I share that on scale? And exactly. That was the inspiration behind this podcast as well.
Yeah, and it's exciting, Chris, because there's a lot of people don't realize there's an awful lot we can do to create better lives for ourselves and each other. There's a lot you can do. It's just that people don't realize. And so, I sort of wake up every morning thinking, let's get the message out. There's some simple things you could do, and hopefully we'll talk about some of them, that can make your life and the life of those around you that you care about much, much better. And that's what sort of gets me out of bed every day.
Yeah. I know you're working on multiple projects at the same time, something we talked about before the show I'm always impressed with. But what's really top of mind for you right now, where we should jump into?
I guess people are concerned and worried about the whole COVID and what's going to happen. So we might want to talk a bit about that. We might want to talk about, the mental health dimensions, the fear, the panic, the anxiety, all of that. And you and I spoke previously, Chris, about your own struggles with all of that. But really, I'm happy to talk about absolutely anything. I mean, as you know, I was just saying to you before we came on, I'm writing 3 books simultaneously at the moment. So I'm a bit of a polymath. So I actually find it quite enjoyable to literally answer questions on any topic, because it's more interesting, certainly for me. I don't know whether people listening, but I find it much more interesting to sort of just meander around wherever you want to take it.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the anxiety piece, because that's something close to home. And all of my friends, family, employees right now is something where the anxiety is at an all-time high, and many people are struggling. And our last call, something that really I've been thinking about ever since we had that first conversation is, was talking about, is it really possible to live without anxiety? Because for many of us, including myself, who suffer from anxiety, panic attacks quite often, something I've been living with since I was a young kid, I've always been under this impression that I just have to live with it and cope. Right. And even some of the experts, so-called experts, it seems, that I speak to, it's more coping mechanisms, more putting a band-aid on it, as opposed to really overcoming it. And I'd love to share what you shared with me last week with everyone listening, which is quite powerful.
Yeah. So it's really the way that we're trained to understand the human system. And so part of my medical journey was not just training as a doctor, I also did a degree in psychology. I have a PhD in immunology. So how does the entire system, the immune system, and actually pulmonary immunology, so COVID is particularly interesting to me because I've got a PhD in the immune system of the lung, right? But how do all these systems interact? And is it possible to really move the dial, or are you just in the territory of you just have to cope with it? Now, I honestly believe, having looked at this in a great deal of detail, that the problem really is the way that we think about the issue. So most people are in that coping. But imagine a world, if I can use a metaphor, if you look at a 2-year-old child, now a 2-year-old child has yet to develop the ability to regulate their emotion to any great extent, which is why when a 2-year-old is upset amongst a bunch of other 2-year-olds, they all get upset. They're highly contagious, and they can't regulate their emotion. Now, as we grow up as human beings, we get a bit better at regulating our emotion, but not that much better. And so there's a point comes where we've got a certain level of emotional regulation, but it's not that sophisticated, and we stop developing that ability. So most people then just become adults with only a very poor capability around the ability to control any one emotional state. So that takes them into the exact territory you're describing, which is, I can't control the anxiety. The anxiety's got me. I haven't got it. That's why it's subjective. It's a subjective feeling. It's got me. The anger's got me. The anxiety's got me. The panic's got me. So how do you flip that around? How do you get it? How do you get control of it? How do you master it? Now, if you don't learn to get control of the anxiety, it's always got you. And the best you can do in those circumstances is learn to live with it. Now, I'm much more optimistic. I think actually you can get a grip of it. You can train yourself to get control of it to such an extent that it will no longer dominate your life. So you're not having to live in fear that the anxiety might overtake you at any moment, that the depression, the black dog that sits on your shoulder might suddenly get control of you. So you're struggling through your life with the fear that the anxiety, the depression might come back at any moment. I genuinely believe it's possible to completely heal that, to get yourself, but it requires you to do a lot of training in emotional regulation skills. And because we never get taught this at school, in fact, many of our clients, we work with lots of CEOs and C-suites, we're dealing with people in their 50s and 60s who've never really learned how to do this. So they sort of struggle through. And ironically, today, we're even making almost like a badge of honor. Let's talk about that fact that we've never learned that ability, which is good. It's a good thing to be able to speak about it openly and publicly. That is a good thing. But we don't go the extra step, which is, well, why don't we not stop just talking about it, actually learn to fix the problem rather than just cope with the problem? So there's a whole kind of sort of curriculum and agenda of stuff that you can do to actually fix the problem. So as I said to you before, Chris, it is possible for you to actually fix it permanently so you don't have to live in fear of the anxiety coming back. That is possible to do.
Mm-hmm. What are some practical steps then that you are training people and working, and not the obviously entire curriculum, but for everyone listening right now who, arguably probably, going through this tough time with everything going on, the anxiety, what are some practical things that we can do to help ourselves and regulate that?
Yeah. So again, if you take there are sort of multiple levels to the human system. So most people can see how people behave. So on the surface, I can watch how you're behaving. You can watch how I'm behaving. What you can't see are the 4 levels below that. So what drives behavior is thinking. So hence cognitive behavior therapy, right? Cognition, the way that we think, determines the choices we make, our behaviors, right? But what's driving cognition? Well, how we think about a thing is driven by how we feel. And how we feel about a thing is driven by our emotions, and our emotions is driven by our biology. So there are 4 levels you can't see. Now, if you collapse the bottom 3 levels into some dimension of thinking, then you've actually sort of lost control of those bottom 3 levels. And so the game is really at the bottom 3 levels. So practical steps start at the bottom with physiology. If you learn to control your biology, and this is much, much easier than people realize, there are certain breathing techniques which will give you control of your biology pretty quickly. And in the breathing sort of training, breath training, there are 12 dimensions of your breath you can control, but the most important is the rhythm. Control the rhythm of your breathing. So forget deep breathing. Deep breathing won't do it for you, won't cut it. But rhythmic breathing will start to change your biology pretty quickly. So if you breathe rhythmically and evenly through the center of your chest, not through the abdomen, so not abdominal breathing, breathe rhythmically and evenly through the center of your chest, then your biology will start to change pretty quickly. And I've done a TED talk on this, so people can go online, look at the TED talk where I actually pulled a guy out of the audience. I put him under some pressure. His biology went into chaos and he couldn't even do simple math because his frontal lobe shut down. And I taught him how to control his breathing. And literally within a minute, he got control of his biology. So this is much easier. And we taught this to school children. We teach this to execs. It's much easier to get control of your biology when you know exactly what to do. So the journey starts with controlling your biology. That's the bottom of the pyramid, as it were, and then moving up to controlling your emotions and your feelings. And that's where most of the game is.
Do you think that's a big challenge that people overcomplicate it? Because in my head, I thought it was so much more complex. I know there's a lot more elements to what you're talking about, but I always thought that it was, something which would take maybe years.
No, but that's the good news, right? It literally doesn't take years. I mean, I've had, men in their 50s and women in their 50s literally reduced to tears when within 1 or 2 minutes they've got control of their biology, because most human beings, or many human beings, go through their life feeling a bit out of control. I can't control the anxiety, I can't control the panic. And I've shown them very clearly, and they can see it live on screen. Oh my goodness, I can control this. I've seen grown human beings weep at the realization for the first time in their life, there is something about my life I can control, and it turns out it's me. Mm-hmm. And it's actually easier than you think. So it's very encouraging when you see people do that.
Well, obviously, I only spoke about my personal experience only a year ago. Before that, I thought I was like an outsider and I was alone in this, and I was a bit crazy. The fear of the fear. So it's like the fear of anxiety, the fear of having a panic attack, which became the fear. So it's like a revolving, never-ending. Or what if I get on a plane and I have a panic attack? What's going to happen? And then it builds up the anxiety, and then you have a panic attack. What a coincidence! Or getting on the train, or being alone. So for a while, I had a thing where if I was alone and no one was around, I'd start panicking for no reason. It was, and I knew rationally that there was nothing wrong with me, but the feeling was still there. And even just speaking with people about it, realizing that there's millions of people around the world that feel the same way. That was already a surprise, because none of my friends and family, there were ones that came and said that I'm feeling the same way, but we all just hid it for so long.
Well, Chris, so you're all really saying, look, none of us have been trained how to do this.
Yes. Yeah.
We need to be trained in schools how to, because it is possible to control these things. All we're really saying is we're all illiterate as far as this is concerned. And that's true. But that doesn't mean we can't get control of it. And that's what we're saying is, look, you can get control of it. We just need to teach you how to do that. And it's actually much more straightforward than you realize.
Fantastic. Well, we're definitely going to delve more into that as well. One of the things that stood out on the last conversation we had was your phrase post-traumatic growth, which I've been using every day with one of my teams and everyone I speak to as well. And I'm trying to really flip it on this head and see this silver lining and improve, come out of this better than I came in. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So when you go through a crisis, there are two paths ahead. So if you come out the crisis, you're going to come out down one of the two paths. Now, unfortunately, most people find crises very difficult. They find change very difficult, the uncertainty, the threat of all of that. And they get into a sort of post-traumatic stress type scenario. They're panicking, they're worried about their future, about the economics, about the future of the world, and so on. That's one path ahead. Or the alternative path ahead is the post-traumatic growth. How does this crisis become an opportunity? And there are two things that will get you down the post-traumatic growth. First of all, the stuff we've just been talking about, emotional regulation. Because a big part of which path you go down, if you're into this vicious cycle, the one that you were just describing, even the fear of the fear, and you get into this vicious cycle as one negative emotion triggers another, which triggers another, which pushes the cortisol level up, which then is the hormone, your body's main stress hormone, which then creates negative emotion in itself. And as the negative emotion increases, you get more cortisol, vicious cycle, right? And so how you break that cycle is emotional regulation is the first step down the post-traumatic growth. You've got to get control of your own emotional response. And so that's the start point. But the real game changer is the ability to make meaning out of a crisis. So what does this really mean? What does COVID-19 mean for me as a human being? What does it mean for my family? What does it mean for the way that we're living our lives and the way we have to adjust? What does it mean for humanity? So if you can find meaning in the crisis, then that will take you down the post-traumatic growth, because you can grow as a result of the crisis. And I used to see this all the time with patients on the wards. There was this very strange phrase that patients used to say to me is, heart attack, best thing that ever happened to me. Cancer diagnosis, best thing that ever happened to me. And you think, wow, that is a really weird thing to say. But what they were really meaning is they sort of woke up. They were living their life a certain way. And as a result of this diagnosis, they woke up and they started to live their life differently and get a lot more enjoyment and fulfillment, started to pay attention to different types of stuff. So then the crisis of that difficult diagnosis became a turning point in their life, and they found a whole new level of meaning. And so post-traumatic growth requires emotional regulation and the ability to discover meaning. So if you focus on those two things, then you'll come out of this terrible pandemic that we're all going through in a much healthier state, and you'll be able to flourish as a result of the crisis rather than crumble.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. On that vein, many of the CHROs, and kind of back to your book, kind of goes along the lines of what we're talking about today as well, is many of the HR executives are seeing this as an opportunity for huge change in their organization and their workplace, which is obviously similar to the name of it. And what inspired that book, and are you seeing that now play out more so in organizations given current events?
Yeah, we absolutely are. So the book that I wrote came out in February. Some of the things we wrote about, because we both basically wrote about, Nick Dalton and myself, my co-author, and I wrote about the past, present, and future of HR. So HR, since it started, with the evolution of the factory system in the sort of mills of Northern England, as it were, back at the sort of turn of the 1900 and 1910, that kind of frame, is started with welfare officers, looking after people largely. So it started way back then. And so we went through all the different, and there are 7 P waves, as we call them, waves of progress, P waves, that the HR community has gone through over the years, and, including what's yet to come. So we're roughly in wave 4 or 5, depending on which organization you're operating in. And we wrote about wave 6 and 7. And we actually described some things that we probably thought won't really get going till about 2025. They're happening now. So COVID has really been a sort of compression of time. We're sort of living through 10 years in 3 months. So it's really accelerated things and created a lot more intensity. And part of the reason for writing about the book is I honestly think, and it's become more obvious since COVID, that now is the time for HR to step up and start leading. So, anybody that's worked in organization has heard this very sort of familiar phrase, people are our most important asset. And I always think that was quite strange. So particularly when CEOs say that to you, oh yes, well, of course, the people are our most important asset. You say, well, is that really true? Because if it's true, why are you spending all the time with the CFO and not the CPO or the CHRO or the HRD? If people are really important assets, why are you spending all the time with the finance guy? And so it was sort of like lip service.
Yeah, exactly.
But now it's true. And particularly COVID has really brought this into sharp focus, is organizations are collections of people. In fact, the word company comes from companis, which means to break bread together. The very notion of a company right, is people breaking bread together. We're in company with each other. And so really now is the time for HR to start leading, and rather than being apologetic and trying to justify itself to the commercial line, with metrics and assets to say, look, we do want a seat at the top table. We're valuable, really. No, start leading. So stop reacting to what's going on in the world and start leading. And so that's why we wrote the book, is honestly think now is the time for HR to step up to the plate and really start to lead. And so we wrote about that and, understand the past, present, and the future. So the way to lead is you understand where you've come from and what's about to happen. And then you can lead and you can give people guidance. And so COVID has really just amplified that. So that's really what the book's about and why we wrote it.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the things that you predicted in 2025 that are now happening now?
Well, the level of flexi working. So rather than, people working on set contracts for set amount of times at set locations, that will move to a full flex model. That people full flex, not only in terms of their compensation package. So people might be paid in very different types of ways, and the hours they work and the locations they work and how they work. So a completely fluid and flexible model. So that was one of them. And also, moving forward, that there was going to be a completely different organizational structure. And we're seeing that happen right now as a result of COVID. Like, so many of our clients, for example, have gone, oh, do you know what? We don't need 90 offices in the UK. Maybe we only need 50, right?
Yeah.
So that's going to change everything, the geographic footprint, and also the way that human beings are connected inside an organization. And one of the things we've built in our company is something called network analysis, which is looking at the way that people are connected to each other, because many companies are still operating with an org chart, which is 1910 technology. So imagine, Chris, I asked you to drive a car that was built in 1910.
Yeah.
Now, most people wouldn't accept that. I'm not driving that car. They want a Ferrari, the latest model. But we're using a 1910 technology called an org chart, and it doesn't represent how a company really works. So, the companies of the future are going to be 3-layered, networked, semi-permeable organizations. And we sort of wrote about that, and that's already happening. Is, with swarms and scrum masters and flex to work and flow, and all of these types of ideas are being talked about. So we didn't think that would become really talked about to any great extent for another 5 years. It's been really talked about right now. So there's a couple of examples of, the future is here.
I was really interested to get your thoughts on, as a new father myself. And when we last spoke, you were talking about how we sort of beat the curiosity out of our kids. And it's something I've actually been sort of looking into myself and doing some research on. So I was pretty fascinated by that. So I'd love if you could jump in and share your thoughts and your research around this.
Yeah, so I've got 4 boys, all grown up now. But kids are, I mean, it's not about yourself, but, why, Daddy? Why? That sort of insatiably curious sort of stance that they take. They're just learning machines. I mean, for example, between the ages of sort of 3 and 6, children acquire 6 new words every single day. So that's a phenomenal language acquisition mechanism. And you only need about 200 or 300 words to actually get by in a foreign language. So kids get that in 3 months. So the speed with which they acquire knowledge and information is phenomenal. So incredibly curious. And then something strange happens at school where, many kids end up leaving school, having spent, 13, 14 years there, almost with an absence of curiosity. So it sort of dies on the way somehow. And I remember speaking at an educational conference a few years ago in Kauai, and about, the whole philosophy and approach to education. And we tend to sort of run a model, as Ken Robinson talks about in his brilliant TED talk, about, getting kids in, nothing, sit down, shut up, listen to me. I'm the expert at the front of the class. I'm going to pour stuff into you. And we don't start from the start point of, you're incredibly curious. What do you want to know about? And at this conference, I saw a teacher do this very interesting thing where, unusually compared to most educational conferences, they actually had children present. So the teacher got these kids out, and ranging from sort of 8 to 14, about 12 of them, and then he literally passed the microphone around. Anybody got any questions? So he was role modeling the way that they teach a class. Anybody got any questions? And the kids had a few questions, and and then they voted on the best question from all the kids. And the kids decided that the best question that any one of them came up with was, do fish fart? So that was incredibly funny. Of course, everybody starts, well, do they? I mean, And so he proceeded to teach us, the entire room. And there was a very sort of learned academics in the room, like a couple of hundred of us, sort of trying to be all terribly professional. And this teacher did this sort of whole thing. Okay, well, what is a fart? Well, it's gas created by bacteria in the gut system. So we're into biology. And then, when a fish farts, it comes out as a gas bubble in a liquid. So we're into physics, then we're on to what is the size of a fart and how would you measure it? And then we're into maths. And so he started to teach the entirety of science from one single question. It was terribly funny, and everybody, I bet, could tell that story to this day. And that was like 20 years ago. Right. So, we're not we don't start from the point of curiosity. The kids are very curious. Why don't we start there rather than, nothing, sit down, I'm going to tell you something. Just cultivating their curiosity as the driving force, that passion to learn. And mysteriously, it's sort of beaten out. So, I quite like to something called surpriseology. There's actually a good book on this. Surprise people, make them sort of stop in their tracks and think about things a bit more. In fact, it's the source of all great humor, as you know, Chris, is when you're telling a joke, for example, you'll take somebody along a certain track and then suddenly you'll take a left turn and it's funny, right? It's the unexpected. So it's the juxtaposition of the normal and the abnormal creates humor. And if you make something amusing, then people remember it better. So cultivating curiosity is an incredibly important thing for learning and for development.
Mm-hmm. And we're still doing the same thing in our workplace. It seems.
Yeah. So isn't it amazing? Beating the curiosity out of people. Stop asking difficult questions. What? Those are the questions you want to ask, the difficult questions. So far away, Chris. Any difficult questions you like?
No, yeah. Oh no, I remember being the youngest manager in the boardroom, and I was, curiosity was through the roof because I was learning, I was developing, and I was on the phone with our clients on the front line. I had so many questions, but the culture within the organization I worked within was like, you don't challenge the status quo, right?
Yeah.
Which is pretty sad at the time.
And also, you're stupid. Don't ask the stupid question.
Exactly.
Sometimes the stupid question is the best question. In fact, a friend of mine runs a company where they've got 14 offices where they do incubator startups all over the world, and they've sort of taken 500 organizations from complete nothing to revenue generation. I had a very interesting conversation. In fact, one of the 3 books I'm writing at the moment is about innovation, the nature of innovation. And he was saying that looking at all of his startup and all these businesses they've helped build, one of the things that predicts the best entrepreneurs is they're unencumbered by content knowledge, which means they're not sort of brainwashed into believing well, that's not possible. So if they don't know too much about their topic, they're not constrained. They're much more free thinking. So they ask the stupid questions. They come up with disruptive and innovative thinking because they don't know they can't. So it's really important for innovation to be curious and to be able to ask the stupid questions. And somehow we've got into this cult of the expert, the person who knows, whether it's a teacher or a leader, or an academic, and in COVID right now, we're turning to follow the science, like the expert people. Now, if you go back a few years in the 2008 economic crisis, there was quite an interesting debate about, well, why didn't we see this coming? And a lot of the UK economists, I don't know whether you know this, wrote a letter of apology to Her Majesty the Queen, apologizing for the fact that they didn't predict the economic crisis. Did you know that?
No.
There was a letter that went to the Queen. Yes, lots of learned academic economists said, I was terribly sorry, Your Majesty. We should have seen this coming. We didn't. There was actually a letter of apology. And now clearly there were some very bright people who did see it coming, but they were the mavericks. They were the people on the edge of the system. And that's where a lot of the innovation comes from. It's people who are unconstrained, who aren't brainwashed to believe a certain thing is true or not true. And that's where you get a lot of the entrepreneurism and the innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All of the ideas that we've started doing in our own organization when I started this business were ideas I was trying to push internally in my last business. But I was always told, there's no value in having a podcast, Chris, where we share our clients' successes and their journey and experience. There's no value in creating these content, just content in general. I was seeing most people double my age. Like, Chris, content. This is like 8 years ago. No one cares about content and live streaming and and social media. That's social media is a personal thing. It's something to do with business. So I was in that era, and I was like, no, this is the future. I'm seeing. Look, here's 70% of my sales are coming through social selling, and then my CEO is like, "What social selling?" I'm like, well, this week, 50% of my pitches have come through people I've connected on LinkedIn and converted in. Right. However, you're measuring my KPIs based on my phone and my emails. So, you're measuring the wrong things. And imagine me going in there after 20 years of operating the same way, trying to convince everyone that social media is this new avenue of revenue we can go down. Everyone looked at me like I was a crazy person.
It's weird, isn't it? Like, you don't know, you don't understand what you're not realizing, Chris.
I got that. Yeah, I got that. Yeah. You're too young, you're inexperienced. I got a lot of that. Chris, you're in sales, stay in sales, because I used to come to, here's a new idea for our product team, or I think this is what our clients are hearing. We should add this to a particular product. And no, Chris, you're in sales. You don't know what you're talking about. A lot of that going on.
It turns out you did know what you're talking about, right? And you're probably outselling all of them by now. So
sadly,
curiosity,
a lot of them are gone. A lot of them no longer exist, and some of them actually I am now advised, which is hilarious in that sense.
Ironic, right?
A bit really ironic. So when some of them reached out a few years back, I was like, oh, this is a bit awkward. But the same thing I'd spoke to you about, that the same person, actually, the CEO that I pitched this podcast to, I was like, listen, we've got this huge network of incredible HR executives all over the world. You have amazing stories and journeys to tell, so much valuable insights. Yes, we have our events. Yes, we have all the other products, but let's just do this. The first question was, well, how we can make money out of it? I was like, no, that's not the reason behind, but what do you mean? Why would you do it then, Chris? Because it's about adding value, giving back to the community, sharing insights. And it was like, no, but where do we make money? That was always the crazy battle that I would have as well. But
there's a lovely story, Chris, on that about what's the biggest thing that predicts you want to start up a new business, and what's the most important thing to make you successful as a business? And you're going to open up a donut shop, right? And so you do this as a thought experiment. It's an entrepreneur's kind of challenge, right? What do you think it is that's going to really, and of course, some people pile in with what you just said. Well, you've got to get the price right. You've got to have a profit to make money. Actually, that's not the most important thing. Oh, brand, you've got to have a certain type of brand and a logo. And no, that's not it either. Oh, you've got to have really yummy donuts, jam donuts, custard donuts. No, it's not that either. And it turns out the best predictor of whether you succeed or fail is a hungry crowd, right?
Because otherwise,
so if you haven't got that community, so you tapped into that, right? Is actually, we'll make money once we've got to get the crowd, we've got to get the community, we've got to get people to follow and connect and start relating to what we're doing. And if we can do that, and that's certainly been the model, and people who have built digital businesses have realized that you start with volume and then you come to the revenue later. So most digital startups, won't turn any profit for some time. They're building the crowd, and then it will eventually flip over. And that's certainly been true of most of the, even the big, like the Facebook
big ones, like SoundCloud, Spotify, all of those. Some of them still not making profit.
Exactly. You've got to build the hungry crowd first, and then it builds the revenue. And that's a very different way to the traditional model that the experts would tell you.
Especially when you're bootstrapping it, like myself, with no investment, that makes it a little bit harder, because they've got a huge runway of years of capital to tap into as well. Don't get me wrong, it's tough, and I remember everyone's like, you need a business plan, you need everything planned out to the T for the next 2 years, and we were just kind of as we always say, sort of jumped out of the airplane and built our parachute on the way down, and just listened. It's like, what's the key to success? Listening, actually listening to what people are asking for in the chat, their needs, and then reacting, as opposed to assuming we've got all the answers, which is never normally.
Well, also, particularly in the world that's changing very quickly, expertise isn't what it was, and experience isn't what it was, right? Because the world's changing. So there's a very interesting thing called knowledge doubling. Now, post World War II, knowledge was doubling every 25 years, and now it's doubling every 13 months. So the entirety of human knowledge used to double every 25 years. Now it's every year, roughly. And IBM have calculated it'll get down to 12 hours. The entirety of human knowledge doubling every day. So that means that's really, really important for businesses to understand that point, because, if you're currently lagging behind your competition, don't worry, because things are changing so fast, you can leapfrog ahead. And if you're ahead, be worried or pay attention, because any of your other people in the market can jump you in a matter of months. And so we're now in this really disrupted world, that's accelerating super fast in this sort of hockey stick thing, the exponential curve. And in those kind of scenarios, the stupid question, unencumbered by content knowledge, the curiosity, all of these things, the experience isn't what it was. Expertise isn't what it was. What's most important is that stuff that you're talking about, which is an agile mind, a curious mind, people who can sense things rather than plan things. And certainly coming out of COVID, some companies we're seeing in our client base trying to plan their way out, almost scenario plan the entire next 3 years. And I keep saying to them, no, what you really need to cultivate is sensory capability. To be able to sense the moments, sense the opportunities, sense which way the customer base is moving, and then respond in a very agile way. So you need sensory capability, not predictive capability. So the old world, back from the 70s, predict and control moves to sense and respond. So the world's changed. And again, one of the things we talked about in the HR book was how the world has changed and how, HR leaders need to lead in that changing world, building sensory capability and building, organizations full of people who are developing, not just learning. So there's something in America called a DDO, a deliberately developmental organization. So that needs to be at the core of the HR strategy moving forward, because a highly developed person can cope and flourish in this accelerating world much better than a less developed person. So the game changer moving forward, which we talked at length about in the book, is what level of development, what level of maturity, what level of sophistication is this exec operating from? And can we really level them up? Can we push them up a level and then up a level too? And if we can, they're going to do an awful lot better than people who are less developed.
Yeah, love it. Something that you just triggered in my memory as well is that you were saying in our last conversation, stop the obsession with learning. And I was like, what? What do you mean? And can you elaborate on that? Because you said stop. It's only 20%, 80% is development.
Yeah. So in L&D spaces, we become obsessed with L. It's all L and no D. We talk about learning organizations and learning curves. We've gone up the learning curve. Well, it's important to learn. It's important to acquire. Learning is basically the acquisition of skills, knowledge, and experience, right? But it's only 20% of the value is in the learning. 80% of the value is in the deployment of that learning, the application of that learning to change your life in a positive way. That's development. It's not learning. You've got to acquire knowledge and deploy the knowledge. So, for example, somebody might read a book about emotional intelligence. Well, I know all about emotional intelligence, and I've now got what's called aboutism. Right? I know about emotional intelligence. I haven't got any, but I know all about it. So I've acquired the knowledge, but in the room, I can't get on with people. I've got no empathy. I can't control my own emotions. I'm not even that emotionally literate, but I know all the theory, but I've got none of the practice. So the practice is where development is, where the value really sits, is not in the acquisition, but in the deployment. So can I turn the L into D? Can the learning become development? So that's when knowledge becomes wisdom. And that's the game changer, really, is, and we talk a lot to HR directors about, look, it's really, really important that you make a fundamental distinction between learning, which is a horizontal phenomena, and development, which is a vertical phenomena. So this vertical development, increasing the level of sophistication, vertical development, described in the States as the #1 trend in leadership for the next 10 years, vertical development, unlocking new levels of capability. That's the game changer.
I said to you when we last spoke, I've been trying to cut down my amount of learning. People are like, what do you mean? Well, because I was reading so much, listening to the podcast, I was not putting anything into action. So exactly. it's all well and good reading it and knowing it, and we've all read books about how to get fit, or the list goes on, right? There's many examples. I've been trying to say it to my friends and family, like, just because you read the book, now focus your time. Don't pick up just another book. Maybe focus now time on actually executing on that and developing.
Yes,
and
exactly right.
Cut down significantly the amount of learning, but now I'm focusing more on the execution piece, which is where the value is. That's where the value is.
Exactly. You know enough. I mean, that's the good news. I don't need to read anything. You know enough already, right? Just deploy, get into the action stage, and you'll make a lot more progress. Absolutely correct.
Can you talk about the 3 big E's?
The 3 big E's. Yes, it's kind of. I like what the Germans called Wortspiel, which is a sort of joke, a word joke, if you will. So that's where my brain works, because I'm a weirdo. Come up with these. Well, it takes one to know one, I guess, Chris. Coming up with these, the 3 big E's. So it's kind of like a play on words. A big E, like that's something that's massive, but it's also the letter E. And so people, particularly in the mental health space, focus on the 2 E's, and doctors focus on 2 of the E's all the time, which is, got a problem? Well, you need a bit of exercise. You're a bit overweight, need to exercise. Now, that exercise, of course, is very important. Or you need to get your diet right. That's eating. So exercise and eating is often trotted out as the answer to so many different problems. Now, those things are important, but what's interesting about that is most people know what a healthy diet really looks like. They're not doing it, the deployment piece, but they don't need any more knowledge or training about eating the right things or exercise. Most people know they should exercise 2 or 3 times a week, and it should be this sort of exercise, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, get the heart rate. Most people know that, right? But eating, whatever you're eating, you eat 2 or 3 times a day, maybe 4 times a day. You exercise 2 or 3 times a week. But the third E that most people miss, which is the E that happens every single second of every single day, is emotion. So when I'm saying to people, look, which do you think is the most important? Do you think it's more important to focus on the thing that happens 3 times a week, 3 times a day, or the thing that happens every single second of every single day? So our view is emotions are the big E. Of the 3 E's, the 3 big E's, emotions the one that is the elephant in the room. And so focus on emotions because unregulated emotions or poorly managed emotions are the super highway to pretty much most of the diseases that modern man suffers. And that's because when you're suffering with negative emotions, so we talked earlier on about anxiety, but it's also true of depression, panic, all those kind of things. If you're racked by anxiety and depression and panic all the time, what you essentially do, fear of COVID would be another one, is you push up your cortisol level. And that elevated cortisol level suppresses your immune system. So it leads you into health problems. So now the body's got an antidote to cortisol, something called DHEA, which is the sort of vitality hormone. So cortisol, the stress hormone, and DHEA are in balance with each other. Now, if you push up cortisol, that cortisol DHEA balance predicts diabetes, senile dementia, heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, depression, all of those things. So we've all got to learn to lower our cortisol and push up our DHEA. And that's through engaging positive emotion. So that's the big E. You get that wrong and you go into that territory of all those modern diseases. So that's the one we should be focusing. Of course, we need exercise, and good food, but the elephant in the room is emotion.
And that really is the biggest thing we can do right now to protect ourselves.
Absolutely,
it is. Our immune system.
And it's not something you hear on, wash your hands, cover a face mask.
Yeah, exactly. That's what
and I think there's something we've got in mental health so confused on mental health. I wrote a blog some time ago saying it's not mental, it's not health. And it caused a bit of a stir because it's quite a provocative thing to say. I'm saying, no, what it really is emotional development. So the fact that somebody suffered, like you were describing with yourself very openly, with anxiety, it's not your fault. Nobody's taught you how to regulate your emotions to a very advanced degree. So you can get into trouble very easily if you've never learned those skills. But it's not a mental health problem because when you're anxious, there's nothing wrong with your mental processes. Mental processes are normal, right? So a mental health thing would be something like schizophrenia, where the mental processes don't work properly, and your brain ends up creating, delusions or hallucinations to try and figure out what's going. That would be a mental health where the mental processes aren't working. But most things that are referred to as mental health aren't mental at all; they're emotional. So we've mislabeled this, and of course, because we've mislabeled, then all that stigma, your mental, all of that kicks in. And then we're having to come up with strategies to reduce the stigma. It's like, guys, we're completely missing the point here. It's emotional development. And once we call it for what it really is, then it gives us an opportunity to fix the thing, right? Which is emotional regulation and developing that capability, starting in schools, but you can start at any age. And now you've got the possibility of fixing it, not just learning to cope, actually fixing the problem. So we've got to change the narrative completely, I think, on mental health. It's not mental, it's not health. It's emotional regulation, emotional development.
Love it. Yeah. And that, again, one of the reasons why I didn't talk about it for many, many years was that stigmatism attached. So I thought that was the number one. What people were going to think of me. It wasn't even about it wasn't even about actually kind of getting better at that point. It was just like the worry about friends, family, work colleagues. What that what are they going to think of me? Coming out of it, as opposed to actually dealing with the real problem.
And as a society, we should be embarrassed. I mean, we imagine children were leaving school unable to add 2 and 2. That would be an outrage. The sort of level of literacy and numeracy, right? And we're all very, very concerned about that. But emotional literacy, not concerned at all. But that's the thing that drives illness, right? And we don't go on about that. That's the thing that actually drives success in business. There's this old phrase when Daniel Goleman first popularized the idea of emotional intelligence, there was this sort of phrase, IQ gets you hired, EQ gets you promoted, right? So success, there was a lot of data about, how EQ, or emotional intelligence, is the thing that drives your career success. So why aren't we teaching that in schools? And why aren't we teaching that in workplaces? Because it game changes the performance of a child in education, and absolutely game changes, because we've seen this in business. We talked a lot about this in all our client base. It game changes human beings' ability to function in the work setting. And certainly in terms of innovation. So as the world accelerates and we need to be more innovative and disruptive and so on, if you're racked with anxiety, the biological turbulence that goes along with the anxiety impairs brain function. If you can change that anxiety into something like determined or focused, it turns your brain back on and you come up with better ideas, better product solutions, better way of managing teams, better way of responding to the COVID, better way of bouncing back. And that's all driven by your ability to regulate your emotions. So we should be teaching this in schools and businesses. It should be part of the induction process, should be part of every leadership development program, but it isn't.
Yeah. What's stopping us from doing that? I feel like we've been talking about this for quite some time, not so much what you've just said, but the problems that exist in our school system we've been talking about for many, many years. I love Ken's TED Talk as well.
Ken Robinson, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like nothing's really happened. My mum was a teacher. Many of my friends actually are teachers. Nothing's changed at all.
That's interesting. I often think the same things about the NHS, and some of the things I think I've seen going on in the NHS are identical to when I was working there 30 years ago. And that's also a really, really interesting question, right? Well, in a world that everything seems to be changing so fast, some things never change. Education, healthcare, criminal justice, almost an oxymoron. It's weird. Some things are changing incredibly quickly, technology and so on, and other things don't change at all. Actually, Chris, I wrote a book about that very phenomena called Wicked and Wise. The reason these things don't change is they're what we call wicked issues. Not wicked in terms of, evil, but wicked in terms of super complicated, super complex ideas, super complex problems that seem intractable, like climate change, like poverty, like politics, like, food, the food health systems globally, food systems globally. Education seems to never really change. And it's because they're super, super complicated or wicked. And so the Wicked and Wise book was to say, well, look, actually, the reason we're not solving these is we're thinking about it wrong. We don't really understand the nature of the problem, and that's why we're not solving it. Look at the evidence. We aren't solving it, so we've maybe misunderstood it. Now, if you change the way you understand what makes these problems really intractable, you can actually break through on all of those issues. But the start point is very different from what most people think. The start point is understanding the nature of wicked issues. And in the book, we wrote out the 6 dimensions of a wicked issue. What makes a wicked issue, and how do you deal with all of those 6 dimensions? And if you do that, you can get a grip of it and you can start to break through, hence wicked and wise. So it's a wise answer to a wicked problem. So if you have some, what we call the rise of the wise, start to apply and deploy some wise answers, you can break through on education, on healthcare, and hopefully post, the COVID crisis. One of the things we need to look at is global healthcare, and how we set up. How is it that some countries have done much better than others?
Yes.
What was going on? Are we sharing the data properly? Are we even diagnosing COVID properly, or deaths from COVID? There is no, global sort of agreed criteria for how to do that. So we need to get much better globally at operating, humanity in terms of managing global health risks. We need to get better at that. So Wicked and Wise really gets into, why some problems are intractable and others not.
Sounds like a good framework for dealing with what we're doing right now in terms of returning to work, right?
Exactly. Well, COVID really is a wicked issue.
Exactly.
And there are 6 waves. The first wave was it affects your health. It's a medical problem essentially, and a psychological, in terms of anxiety and fear. That was wave 1. Wave 2 was the overwhelm of the healthcare system. And then, so people then, you've got to flatten the curve and all of that. And And then after you sort of overwhelm the healthcare system, you get some of the economic problems, and you see the rising unemployment rate in the UK, and and people are now worrying about that. And then interestingly, you get some of the relationship problems. Well, what does this mean between the relationship between I'm working from home, and my commute from work is 7 seconds from my bed to my desk. So that sets all relationship issues, and it set relationship issues with my co-workers who I don't see in the office anymore. My relationship with other people. So is the response appropriate to be so ethnocentric, and just hunker down into my nation state, or do we need a global approach? And then there are systems changes, like what will actually change to the global healthcare system? What will change with our economic system? Will universal basic income become de facto in all countries? System change. Will we stop flying around the world quite so much? And then unintended consequences. So it's a wicked problem because there's lots of complexity to COVID. So COVID is just the latest wicked problem, hitting humanity. Roll the clock back a few months before COVID. Australia was on fire and Indonesia was underwater. Roll the clock back a few months before that, we had Brexit. Roll the clock back a few months before that, we had Extinction Rebellion. So, there are wave after wave of these wicked problems, and we've got to wake up. We've got to wake up and really understand the nature of these problems, and HR leaders are at the vanguard of that, because I generally think that political leadership globally is a busted flush. Religious leadership, hasn't really been present to any great extent for a couple hundred years. Business leaders are our only hope now. Business leaders. So in some of the clients we've been talking to have taken a much more appropriate, sophisticated, mature response to this pandemic than governments have, because they're multinational. Many governments have taken a very parochial view, UK-centric or US-centric or Germany-centric or Singapore-centric or whatever it is. But multinationals, because they're multinational, have had to look across the entire world. And some of our clients actually bought ventilators and testing equipment 2 months before any government said they needed to, because they could see what was happening in China, in Wuhan, and they responded accordingly. So, leadership across the globe is now down to business leaders. And amongst those business leaders, HR leaders can really step up. That is the great opportunity here for the HR community.
Well, Alan, I feel like we could talk forever on the show, but I'll let you go at some point. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's absolutely fascinating chatting with you, and you definitely are a polymath. Go 10 multiple different directions. Before I wrap up, if there's sort of one parting piece of advice to everyone, what would that be? And then secondly, where can they connect with you, follow you, learn more about your work?
One piece of advice: before you do anything else, manage yourself, because you need your frontal lobes on. So manage your emotions first before you try and do anything. Step one. That's always going to be step one. And then I'd love to hear from anybody that's been listening. Part of building all these things that can really move the dial in the world is to get them out there. So we work with 100 multinationals, but we're very interested in talking to anybody that wants help, support, whether it's coaching, team development, organizational assessment. We do a load of stuff. Look at our website, completecoherence.com. But more than anything, get a conversation going. We might just be able to help you, because we thought a lot about it, and we're really, really passionate and obsessed by what really, really moves the dial. And that's what I think we need right now. The time has gone from things that are nice, well-intended, but don't move the dial. We need things that move the dial, and that's what we're focused on.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, and thanks to everyone on LinkedIn for tuning into both parts of the show. We appreciate you coming back to join us. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. See you later. Thanks a lot, Alan. Bye.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Bye.